Dear students, in this module, we will study about language policy and planning, especially in regard to the modern nation states. So let's first define the term language planning. The term language planning was introduced by the American linguist Gunnar Hugin in the late 1950s and refers to all conscious efforts that aim at changing the linguistic behavior of a speech community. It can include anything from proposing a new word to a new language. Cooper, another scholar, has suggested the definition language planning refers to deliberate efforts to influence the behavior of others with respect to the acquisition, structure, and functional allocation of their language codes. So, by this, we can understand that whenever in a society or in a nation a new language is introduced, or a new role for a language is introduced, or new forms are introduced in a language, it comes under language planning. So language planning includes activities like reviewing writing system or giving scripts, reforms in spellings, uniforming, making it uniform, the spelling system as well as the writing system and grammar, choosing official language, place of minority languages in education, place of mother tongue in education, language of media and administrative notices, documents, coining of new terms for new usages, building technical vocabulary, languages used or admissible in courtroom, original or in translation. So all of these activities will come under language planning. Now let's describe the term language policy. What is language policy? Language policy is sometimes used as a synonym for language planning. However, more precisely, language policy refers to the more general linguistic, political, and social goals underlying the actual language planning process. Although language planning is a widespread and long-standing practice, only in the 1960s, when a large number of newly independent nations in Asia and Africa faced the question of the selection and implementation of a national language, did language policy and planning emerge as an area of socio-linguistic inquiry. So Juan Covarrubias has identified four major ideologies that underlie the development of language policies: linguistic assimilation, linguistic pluralism, vernacularization, and internationalization. But before we come to these terms and define them and know what these mean, we should be clear about the difference between language policy and language planning. So, to sum it up in one line, the difference between language policy and language planning is that language policy is the idea and planning is the execution part. First ideology that we will discuss is linguistic assimilation. The ideology of linguistic assimilation is based on the belief that everyone should be able to speak and function in the dominant language of the community or nation. Examples of this approach are numerous, and it is safe to say that linguistic assimilation has been the most common model for language planning. One example of linguistic assimilation policy being implemented could be the schools for Native American population or indigenous American population set up in America 200 years ago. On March 3, 1819, the Civilization Fund Act ushered in a new era of assimilationist policies, leading to the Indian boarding school era, which lasted from 1860 to 1978. The act directly spurred the creation of the schools by putting forward the notion that native culture and language were to blame for what was deemed America's Indian problem. Native families were coerced by the federal government and Catholic Church officials into sending their children to live and attend classes at boarding schools. About one third of the 357 known Indian boarding schools were managed by various Christian denominations. According to the Act's text, Christian missionaries and other persons of good moral character were charged with introducing native children to the habits and arts of civilization, while encouraging them to abandon their traditional languages, cultures, and practices. This is what achieving civilization looked like in practice. Students were stripped of all things associated with native life. Their long hair, a source of pride for many native people, was cut short, usually into identical bowl haircuts. They exchanged traditional clothing for uniforms and embarked on a life influenced by strict military style regimentation. Students were physically punished for speaking their native languages, and some of these students were speakers of Navajo, Ojibwe, Odham, Blackfoot, Western Apache, Khorasan, Cherokee, etc. So these languages were affected, and the native population was affected. They were made to feel inferior, and also that they need to change. They cannot take pride in their cultural identity that the Europeans could. And moreover that, contact with their family and community members was discouraged or forbidden altogether. And some of the students who have survived those boarding schools, they say that there was a culture of pervasive physical and sexual abuse at the school, and infrastructure was also poor. Many students died. The adherents of this linguistic assimilation ideology believe that the linguistic minority or the cultural minority should move towards or adopt the dominant language and culture, and it will lead to more progress and economic development. Statistical correlations between national multilingualism, poverty, and lack of industrializations have occasionally been interpreted as forming a causal relationship, and monolingualism was promoted as the cost efficient way to development and economic progress. But nobody here paid attention to why this should come at the cost of minority language and culture. And if everybody is treated as equal and everybody is an equal citizen, then why some citizens should be asked to sacrifice their language and culture at the altar of development while the development comes for everyone? So, linguistic as well as cultural or ethnic variation was believed not only to obstruct communication but also to generate social and political conflict, which in turn would hinder economic progress, as if subjugating, oppressing people would not lead to political and social unrest. Progress should come, but not at the cost of marginalized communities and ill treatment of a section of citizens by others. This is something that I would want you all to think about and ponder on, and we can discuss more on this in the class. Next ideology that we'll discuss is linguistic pluralism. Linguistic pluralism stresses the multilingual reality of societies and involves the coexistence of different language groups and their right to maintain and cultivate their languages on an equitable basis. So it recognizes that societies are diverse and that all the groups who are there have a right to maintain their languages equally. They all have an equal right to maintain their languages and their culture and to have a peaceful coexistence with each other. A well known example of a pluralistic language policy is that of India, where 22 languages are officially recognized in the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India. Most of these languages are used on a regional basis, with only English and Hindi being used nationwide, official languages at the level of the Union. Today, many language planning theorists view cultural pluralism and multilingualism as sociolinguistic facts which have to be seen positively, and languages or diversity as a resource that should be utilized for the progress of the nation. Next ideology is that of vernacularization. Vernacularization involves the selection and restoration of an indigenous language or languages as main vehicles of communication and as official language or languages. An example is Papua New Guinea, where two pidgin-based indigenous languages, Tokpisin and Hirimotu, have official status alongside English. Another example could be Israel, where Hebrew was restored and made the official language of Israel. When we were studying about standardization, I have spoken to you in detail about this case. Next ideology is that of internationalism. The ideology of internationalization refers to the selection of a non indigenous language or wider communication, often abbreviated to LWC in language planning studies, as an official language or language of instruction. Just as with the ideology of linguistic assimilation, internationalization is based on the paradigm of modernization through westernization and goes hand in hand with the strategies of linguistic assimilation. The adoption of a non indigenous language of wider communication, typically the language of the former colonial power, has characterized language planning in many post colonial countries. So, this is one ideology that has its root in the colonial past of many of these countries that have adopted this. In the early days of language planning, Western sociolinguists argued that the ethnic neutrality of a European language will help to prevent ethnic segregation and facilitate national integration. Choosing a foreign language was believed to be uniformly unfair to all citizens, while choosing an indigenous language would give advantage to one ethnic group. I hope you remember about anti-Hindi agitation in Madras that we talked about when we were doing language identity. The consensus recommendation to the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia was to select a major European language for official use, while indigenous languages could serve other more local functions that resulted in diglossia and thus inferior status to indigenous languages. Kenya, Tanzania, Namibia have English as official language and language of higher education. Now, many of you may say that in our country also, English is the most powerful language. It has better status than all Indian languages. It is used as one of the languages at the union level and also as medium of instruction in elite educational institutions. Even if it is not mentioned explicitly anywhere, but practically English is a prerequisite for upward socio-economic mobility in India. It so this has to do with India being a British colony before independence in 1947. And it also has to do with the position of English in the world today as the language of wider communication between different nations for business and other such ties, and also in the business establishments like MNCs. English being the language of North America also has a huge impact on the power that English has. Why? Because a lot of technological developments have taken place in America and it dominates world politics as well as economics. It also has a lot of soft power in form of its popular culture. What I want to say is that even though our ideology is that of linguistic pluralism, but as we have been under a colonial power, there are issues that have arisen as a result of that experience, and this is one of them.